Good morning or afternoon, and welcome to the Work Group 3 webinar looking at purchase goods and services and capital goods, the Excel tool, user guide, and methodology. My name is Madison Adams, and I work at Ascent Compliance, and I am just going to be helping out with the moderation of today's webinar and making sure everything goes well. I just want to go through some housekeeping items for some of you that may not be familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel. We do recommend that you use either earphones or a headset to listen to the webinar through your computer's audio. However, if you do prefer to call into the webinar, feel free to click the phone call button in the control panel, and the phone number and PIN access code will allow you to hear the webinar. You are muted during the entire presentation, but able to submit your questions and encouraged to via the chat box, also in that GoToWebinar control panel that typically populates on the right side of your screen. The presenters will go through questions at the end, and if your question is not answered, we'll make sure to try and follow up with you directly. This presentation is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email that will contain the recording and the slides. With that, I'm going to pass it over to today's presenter, Rick Love from Raytheon, to get things started. And welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Madison. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Rick Love. I work at Raytheon Technologies, and I am a proud member of Work Group 3, which included several people from IAEG, working on this project to develop a Scope 3 purchase goods and services and capital goods GHG emissions calculation tool and methodology. So I'm going to start with a couple of basic housekeeping. As with all IAEG meetings and events, we have to have a compliance reminder. So we will conduct all IAEG work in compliance with IAEG governance requirements and policies, including the antitrust compliance policy. We will distribute an agenda before all meetings and abide by the agenda, distribute timely and accurate minutes after all meetings, have no conversation or other exchange that even appears to be leading to a discussion of prices or pricing policy or other restraints on competition of any kind. IAEG activities may not include collection or dissemination of prices or pricing methods or use of named suppliers in specific business transactions. Hang on, try to advance here. Before starting a project involving collection or dissemination of competition or competition-sensitive data, antitrust legal review is required. The project must be designed to avoid adverse impacts on competition. Do not disclose export-controlled technical data, member proprietary information, unless under board-approved non-disclosure agreement. Do not request or collect personal data about individuals participating in IAEG activity except in compliance with a privacy policy. These guidelines apply to informal conversations as well as formal IAEG activities. So with that, let me begin the discussion on the tool. Today's plan is to define the tool and the project that we've just completed, and then have a demonstration of the tool by Aaron Williamson from Northrop Grumman, and then conclude with just sort of a summary of some benefits. Before I begin, I want to really make note of the invaluable contribution that both Matt Payne of Rolls-Royce and Aaron Williamson of Northrop Grumman gave to the team. I mean, the team had several IAEG members involved in a lot of meetings, a lot of calls, and some very interesting discussions. But Matt and Aaron herded the cats, made sure that we were doing what we were supposed to be doing. They dealt with the consultants, and then they did a tremendous amount of the legwork themselves. So we really all owe them a significant debt of gratitude. So I thought I'd begin the discussion just by reminding people and level setting sort of about basic GHG emissions accounting. So the GHG reporting protocol really refers to, as many of you I'm sure know, three basic scopes of GHG emissions. So scope 1 is direct company facility use of fuels, GHG emitting chemicals, company vehicles. Scope 2 is your purchase of electricity, including chilled water and steam. And scope 3 are the downstream and upstream activities associated with your business that generate GHG emissions. And we will be focusing, and this tool focuses on scope 3. And specifically, scope 3 has 15 categories in the GHG reporting protocol. And in previous project that Workgroup 3 did to develop an aerospace industry supplement to the GHG reporting protocol, and some of you perhaps on that team, they took a look at scope 3 categories for relevance and materiality, because those are two things that when you talk about scope 3 reporting are essential to determining what's important to report and what perhaps isn't. And in looking at the 15 categories, it was determined that purchased goods and services and capital goods are both relevant and perhaps the largest categories of scope 3 emissions for many IAEG member companies. So the project was undertaken to come up with a methodology to help IAEG companies calculate those two specific scope 3 categories. And you'll note here there's also a yellow box around two categories: use of sold products and end-of-life treatment of sold products. That's just sort of a side note that both of those categories typically involve the inclusion of business confidential information. So those two and that whole subject is outside of the remit of IAEG. So among the many activities that IAEG has been involved with GHG emissions, you will not be seeing anything relative to those because, again, it potentially has some business confidential information to it. So just to level set everybody, so what are purchased goods and services? And capital goods. So as the name implies, purchased goods and services are materials, parts, components, tools, including software, that are directly related to the making of a final product. Capital goods are typically final products that are purchased and used by a company in the production of products. So as you can see on the left-hand side, PG&S is standard parts, systems assembly, structural parts, plain materials, software, avionics, office consumables. Capital goods are production equipment, machinery, buildings, vehicles, and the like. Now, it's important to note that sometimes the accounting of purchased goods and services and capital goods from a financial perspective can be a little confusing. Different companies use different guidance to identify which items fall within those two categories. So you should make sure that if you're going to use the tool to do scope 3 emissions accounting, that you are putting the various categories and materials in the right buckets. So check with your finance folks for guidance to see how they determine what the definition of purchased goods and services are and capital goods, because you want to comport with what your financial people do. It's also very important to establish a consistent methodology. So if you're going to continue to use this tool over a period of years, you want to make sure that you were accounting for things the same way in order to be able to compare the output of the tool. So the deliverables that we're going to talk about today and are available to you all is really three things. It's the calculation tool, which is an Excel spreadsheet that has a tremendous amount of utility, and we'll get a demonstration of that in a bit. There's a user guide, which, like any tool, the user guide is essential in understanding how to operate the tool. The tool, I got to be honest, is quite simple in its operation in my experience. But anyway, the user guide certainly will show you everything there is to know about how to operate the tool. And then there's an underlying methodology document that really talks about emission factors and the underlying structure behind the calculation of these emissions and how it is that the tool actually uses that structure to produce usable information. So the tool offers, and the goal of the tool is to offer aerospace companies a way of quantifying GHG emissions in these two categories while accounting for the varying operational capabilities among companies. Because the effort associated with collecting the data needed to do a spend-based calculation versus a mass-based calculation differs. So it's not, so in many organizations, and this is the underlying principle of the tool, is you have to walk before you run. So if you're taking a spend-based approach, it is the least data intensive. It is the easiest to do, but it produces the least precise of the three options that the tool, the precise data, emissions inventories that the tool presents. If you go with a mass-based approach, it's the most data intensive. It takes some effort. I mean, to collect all that data on all of the materials that were used as inputs into products, particularly in large aerospace companies, is a substantial undertaking. But it does provide more precision. And one thing that we did was, in recognition that this is maybe a continuum as companies decide what to do about moving forward with calculating these levels of emission, the tool provides a hybrid approach. So you can put in spend-based information in some cases, mass-based information in others, to have sort of this hybrid view of those two categories of Scope 3 emissions: purchase goods and services and capital goods. So as noted in the box, the tool requires input for annual procurement in either mass of material used, by material type, and we'll get into those categories in a minute, by kilogram, and or spend, and you can put in dollars or euros in order to generate the output. You should try to have the data, whether you're picking spend or mass-based, be as close to 100% as you can. So if you're going to go with spend-based, you want to get as close to 100% of your annual procurement for purchase goods and services and capital goods as you can. Similarly, you want to get as close to 100% of the mass of materials used. Because of the terminology that we use, the tool includes standard aerospace terms for goods and categories and processes, but different companies refer to these things in a different way. So, for example, I used the tool and worked with our supply management people to make sure that what I was calling a particular type of purchase good and material category was similar, or at least I understood how they were referring to it. And that way we were able to map those. And now that we have the map set, going forward, every year when I get data from them, I can easily map their nomenclature for a particular type of category of material, say, and how we refer to it in the tool. Now, a word on the sources of information. So the tool really lives, the heart of it is these, significant number of emission factors. And when we began the project, we decided that we really needed to have emission factors that meet a few criteria. First and foremost, whenever possible, we wanted to use public sources. So it was much easier to find public sources, and then we weren't going to have to spend money, to be honest, and be beholden to private emission sources. And there were all kinds of sort of clearance issues with some of those as well. Whenever possible, we want the emission factor to be what many of you know as cradle to gate. So cradle to gate is the upstream impact of a particular material or in this maybe component. So using metals as an example, cradle to gate is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the mining of the ore, the refining of the ore, the creation of the steel, the cutting of the steel, the stamping of the steel, the transportation of the steel up to your gate of your factory, where then you take the steel and use it as in part of your product. So the emission factor cradle to gate reflects all of those life cycle impacts, the upstream impacts, in one emission factor number. We also wanted to make sure that we tried, to the extent possible, to get databases that were updated within the last 5 years. There are some sources of emission factors that were academic research projects or other kind of projects that were maybe established and were perfectly good 10 years ago, but they haven't been updated. So we wanted to make sure, to the extent possible, we could find the most current, again, publicly available cradle to gate emission factors. We wanted to make sure we reflected the geographical scope of IAEG members. So it's the US, Europe, Japan, Brazil, or China. And lastly, we wanted to include environmental extended input-output, EEIO tables, which as part of the spend-based approach. Some of you may be familiar with the Carnegie Mellon University models, and they provide both greenhouse gas emissions, but also a wide variety of econometric impacts as part of their EIO output model. So we wanted to include those in our tool as well. So we're about to have Erin take us through the tool with a demonstration, but just to sort of level set you as to how we take all those emission factors and organize them. So they're organized first and foremost by a summary group. So you'll see we have four groups: assembly and structural components, manufactured components and materials, raw materials, and services. And then within each group are various categories. So using assembly and structural components, there's metallic components, there's non-metallic components. And then for each of those categories, there are emission factors, a spend-based emission factor and a mass-based emission factor. So your inventory for purchase goods and services and capital goods are going to be an aggregation of group, category, and then associated emission factor as best as you can to define your overall process. So with that, let me turn this over to Erin.
Okay. All right. So I'll take you on a walkthrough of this tool quickly, as Rick described some of the key components here and the key objectives. So there are a few tabs that users will navigate as we move from the starting point to actually garnering emissions inventories at the end. So we'll start on the README tab, which is a brief overview of some of the user functions. And there's a larger explanation in the user guide document, but this is a quick reference as you're beginning the process here within the tool. So it gives an overview of the objectives, discusses the different color coding of the various cells, so you can see where input is required and where calculations cannot be modified. And then it walks through an explanation of each of the tabs. So I'll go ahead and share that so we don't have to read there. But in case you're using the tool and you need a quick reference, you can always come back to the README tab to find those details. So we'll start with the decision tree. And we'll start here. So this is a tool that will help determine what is the best methodology or approach. So again, as Rick mentioned, we have the spend-based, the hybrid, and the mass-based methodology options. And so this tree helps the reporting individual and reporting company determine what levels of input is best suitable for the levels of data that they have access to. So it asks if you're planning on reporting at a medium or high level of accuracy. If no, maybe this is my first year, I've only got very preliminary data, that automatically recommends a spend-based approach. If you maybe are more mature along that curve and you would like to report at a medium or high level, then you can follow the tree along, and maybe you are looking at the data that you've got from perhaps your procurement or supply chain organization, and depending on whether you have mass-based data available for most of all of your purchase goods or services, and you are willing to put some additional time, again, the mass-based data is more accurate but does require a little bit more effort on your part. So that would allow you to complete that more accurate mass-based assessment. Whereas if you do not have mass-based data for most of all of your purchased goods, but you maybe do have that information available for some of those primary raw materials, and you're willing to put in a little bit of extra effort, that's where the hybrid between the mass for some categories and the spend-based methodology for some categories becomes appropriate. So from there, that's a little bit of guidance. You can move on then to the import data sheet, which is where really most of the effort will be spent. So the first thing you want to select is the reporting year. So for this year, we would select 2019. Particularly if you're using the spend-based approach, you'll want to make sure you select either dollars or euros. And then you'll move on to these two tables. We have the same table essentially for purchase goods and services, as well as capital goods. So I've got some examples pre-populated here, but I'll walk you through how you generate each one of these using the category groupings that Rick showed. So we'll label this category purchase goods and services item number 7. And maybe you're looking at your supply chain inventory that represents your annual spend, or perhaps you've got mass-based data and you've got a category called sheet metal. And so maybe you have a mass-based sheet metal that's specific to aluminum, but maybe you've got another category that's represented by spend that's much more generic. So from there, that spend-based approach that you've selected for that line item will then prompt you to select which of the 4 groupings that you would assign or map your expenditure category to. So with sheet metal, we'll say raw materials, metallic raw materials. Again, these are kind of a cascading level of pick lists. And then from there, you can say, all right, my sheet metal, I don't know what it is, so let's call it metals of an unknown material and mass. And then we populate how much we spent on that based on the data that you receive. Let's say it's $600,000. And you'll add those lines line by line. And again, that's where the mass-based options become much more refined. You can see, for instance, in one of these mass-based lines that I've selected, you have many more options because there are more precise emission factors associated to various materials that generate a more accurate reflection, because the embedded greenhouse gas emissions upstream is easier to determine from mass and doesn't really change depending on spend. This table over to the right is where you can track the data source, the contact, and any assumptions. So again, consistency year over year, as Rick mentioned, is key to making sure the items that you track through your spend are consistently reported. So maybe I got this from Global Supply Chain. John Smith is the contact, and the assumptions are assuming we do not know metal type. And so as those line items come up year over year, you can reflect back on the previous year's reporting to track any assumptions you made and ensure consistency. So I've got several pre-populated here. Again, for capital goods, it's very much the same process. So we'll add a line item here, capital goods 6. Let's say we bought some fleet vehicles for a site. We'll say 6 trucks. Oftentimes for things in the capital goods category, spend-based is more appropriate. Just more likely that you may have spend-based data for things like a fleet vehicle, for instance. So we'll choose the category, fleet, and then the subcategory, we'll say light-duty vehicles, and we'll say $300,000. Again, you have the table to populate your assumptions, and then you can complete all those inputs as you see fit to represent as close to 100% of your annual spend. Now remember that both of these categories capture the embedded carbon over the lifetime of any purchased goods or services or capital goods, but for only goods purchased within that year. So these 6 trucks, their entire lifetime worth of carbon emissions embedded are captured and reported in that reporting year in which they were purchased. But that means we do not have to report any embedded carbon for those same 6 trucks in subsequent years. So it's only capturing data in which those items were purchased in that year. So from the Import Data tab, we can move over into the Results Overview, which provides a series of outputs to help us understand the breakout of these inputs that we've provided. So the first breakout is this table that shows Each of those categories within purchase goods and services and capital goods, it shows the roll up of the emissions at that top level category, the subcategory, and then the breakout of total emissions. So you can see for purchase goods and services, for this example, we're reporting approximately 2 million metric tons. And we can see here that raw materials represents roughly 2/3 of that. So at first glance, that's an immediate indication that that's where the heavy emissions impact is happening in that category. We have the same table for capital goods. We have fewer categories here, reporting roughly 1.1 million for a total emissions inventory of just over 3 million metric tons. So that's kind of the high level breakout of the numerical representation. Then we can get over into some of the visual breakout that's going to be really impactful for communicating that inventory to various stakeholders, or to really visually understand where those impacts are happening. So this first donut chart shows that entire 3 million, both purchase goods and services, as well as capital goods. And then you can see here over on the left-hand side, a color-coded key where you can determine where these slices of impact. Again, we identified raw materials as a big category within purchase goods and services. So you can see that larger blue component is taking up a pretty good size of that donut. Similarly, we saw that capital goods is roughly 1 million out of the 3 million total. So you can see that gray component representing capital goods. Another key piece here is you can look at the breakout here of spend versus mass-based. So this bar across the bottom just shows what percentage of input is spend-based versus mass-based, and that represents the number of inputs, I believe. And then as purchase goods and services and capital goods are indeed separate categories, within the scope 3 reporting of those 15, those are 2 separate categories. It's helpful to understand the breakout between those separately. So we've got a donut chart for purchase goods and services, and then we've got one for capital goods as well. And then lastly, as we move into the final visualization, again, for both purchase goods and services on the left and capital goods, you've got a bar chart breakout of each of those categories, as well as a cumulative line that indicates, you know, as you add from left to right, the impact grows up to the 100% of your total inventory for that particular category. And so to peel back the curtain a little bit, I'll just briefly walk through some of the back-end calculations. So here, this is all pre-populated. There's no input required on the GHG emission calculations tab, but this will show you highlighted in blue for every single option of category you saw in those drop downs. You'll see highlighted in blue the ones that you've populated and selected, as well as the quantity that you've entered as an input into the tool in which unit. So you can see here we have a few that we selected in this example, and then everything else is grayed out. So if you're really looking to understand how the calculations are made, you can scroll across. Column L shows the emission factor, which is referenced from a hidden table, the unit, and then column N is where the calculation of that emissions is calculated for that category. So essentially it's the quantity that you've input multiplied by the value of the emission factor and then converted accordingly into metric tons of CO2, which is the common unit that most of the disclosures that we are asked to report to in our industry are requesting those emissions inventories. And then lastly, this is a tool that is intended to be updated and maintained every year. So with that being said, there are some assumptions and conversions that need to happen and be populated. We have an inflation rate, both again, Euro, US dollars for cumulative inflation rate, and then we need to have a conversion from US dollars into euros. And that is because many of the emission factors are only given in one currency or another. So this is something that typically we will include in our annual maintenance process, which I'll talk about just a little bit here. Each year, the intention is for work group 3 to do some of these updates, including these conversions, as well as update and evaluate those drop-down categories and the emission factors. So as Rick pointed out in the emission factor sources slide, many of those emission factors we've held to a series of design requirements. And as such, we'll be evaluating those emission factors on an annual basis to ensure that they're still the most up to date. And then if there are any updates, often those are published at intervals of several years or refreshed every so often. We will make sure from a structural end that those are updated where necessary. And then we will also ask for annual feedback on the tool. For instance, if there's a category that could use inclusion that's not included, to map a spend category in the aerospace and defense industry, we'll want to make sure we review any feedback that we get on an annual basis. And so, at this point, we are asking IEG internally to test as sort of a first review beyond what work group 3 has already done. So if there are any missing categories or areas for inclusion, that's something that we will ask you to provide to us in a survey, but do know that we intend to maintain this tool on an annual basis and release updates so that it is the most up to date and the most useful for everybody in their new reporting year. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Rick to finish out the slides.
Okay. Thank you. One sec. Okay, and Erin, can you see the benefits of the tool slide?
Yes, I can.
Great, thanks. Okay, a quick wrap up then of the benefits of the tool, which was hard, modestly speaking, to keep them all on one slide because the benefits are so numerous. But so the tool provides your organization from entry level to an advanced user with the ability to calculate these material scope 3 emissions categories using spend-based, mass-based, or a hybrid of the two. And it isn't a precise tool in that it's calculating a number along the lines of, a weight, but it's accurate, and it's accurate enough to provide you with the ability to determine how your inventory is apportioned across different categories of supply. So as Erin was showing in the results charts, I mean, it gives you, what went into purchase goods and services, what went into capital goods, and then you can also, speciate it down to different categories. But also, if you follow the methodology and, establish a methodology and you use it in successive years, your baseline number and then subsequent years is quite indicative. So regardless of whether the precise grand total is what a life cycle assessment would come up with, if your purchase goods and services change 5% or 10% year over year and you're using the same methodology, that's actionable information. That's very useful information. So it does allow you then to focus on improvement activities if your organization is of a mind to do that. This other one, it provides a consistent approach across the aerospace and defense industry. Now, there's various reasons why that's important. I'm assume that pretty much everybody on this call is involved or at least conversant with things like CDP reporting. Maybe you're working on SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board reporting, TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. All of those organizations ask for comparability in your reporting between you and the members of your sector. So to the extent you're able to support that when you're reporting out to these organizations and your investors by using a methodology that applies specifically to your sector, it really meets the goals of those organizations. And that, I think we've all seen that Scope 3 reporting is increasingly important from some of those organizations, but it's also within your own organization itself. It's a significant source of emissions, and if you're interested in driving improved performance in your organization, you do have to understand those emissions. So this tool does that for you. It does allow you to compare roughly to peers if you had the data. But again, since your methodology and how you're calculating, or whether it's a hybrid mix versus the next guy's, comparisons should be along the lines of if your organization is improving and the other one is not improving, not your finite numbers versus their finite numbers. The tool does use purchasing categories that are commonly used across aerospace and defense. So like I said, you're going to have to map those to supply management, but many of them are direct matches based on my conversations with our supply management people. So it really is applicable to aviation and defense companies. If you want, you can customize it. As Erin showed, you can sort of get into the weeds there. You can add your own emission factors and purchasing categories. So if you have a source of, say, private emission factors that, accurately depict your conditions, you can certainly do that. There is going to be an annual maintenance process, so we will update the emission factors without having to go with consultants' input. The data are available and the whole process is retained within your own firewalls. So it's an Excel-based spreadsheet that you keep on your computers and your networks. So there's no possibility of outside organization getting a look of your data unless you want to share it with them. And like I said, it does enable our industry to, meet the expectations, the growing expectations in some cases of the investor and reporting community. I saw a report recently that showed that a handful of industries and industry sectors were identified as having gotten together and created Scope 3 emission calculation tools for their particular industrial sector. So I think IAEG members can be justifiably proud that we really are on the sort of the leading edge and the sort of the vanguard of this kind of activity. So Erin's going to conclude because as our manager in this program, this is where we get to the ask part. So we showed you what you have, we showed you what was now available, but Erin's going to sort of ask for your help in a couple of things.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So just as a high-level overview of the work that's been done so far, so we embarked on this nearly 18 months ago, and throughout 2019 we spent a lot of time in the design in terms of engaging with the consultants, engaging with you all on expectations, and then putting together those 3 deliverables that Rick introduced. So the original testing was done within Workgroup 3 kind of throughout the course of the end of last year and the beginning of this year following our last in-person face-to-face. And so now that we have started moving forward with that testing, the phase 2 of the pilot or beta test is we will ask you all as the full IAEG membership beyond Workgroup 3 to do some testing as well to ensure that we capture any feedback that may be still outstanding, understand where there may be limitations on user experience that we can improve, and also that reporters are able to use the tool and walk through each of those tabs that I demonstrated to ultimately get to a point where you have an acceptable emissions inventory for these 2 categories that are, again, very considerable and material throughout our industry. So
and one thing,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. One thing to note on the testing, you don't need to collect actual company data in order to test it. If you look in the user guide, there's some examples, as you saw in Erin's demonstration. She was winging it. You can wing it and just to see how the tool functions. And so your comments based on, on the assumption that if you're putting in data, and yes, when it comes time to really use the tool for real, you'll get data from your organization. But for the testing, you don't need to, you can just make up the data, obviously.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, you may already have an established relationship with your supply chain organization where you can easily access that. And if that's something that requires a little bit longer of lead time, we would just ask you to play around with some mock data or some model data, as I did, and capture any challenges, any feedback, both positive and negative, areas for improvement. And within the next month or so, we will be releasing through SAE Communications a SurveyMonkey tool. So we've done that before in order to capture some of the initial requirements for this project back in January of 2019. And so we'll do that again and really ask you all to provide any thoughts, feedback, improvements, suggestions, and to take into consideration by work group 3 as we work towards the final approval process. So that process will be done throughout the rest of the year. We will ultimately be working towards submitting the tool for WRI GHG protocol built on logo accreditation. This is the same accreditation that we have for our supplemental guidance, and ultimately we would like for this tool to have the same accreditation so that it is stamped with the gold standard of greenhouse gas accounting and is kind of up to the requirements of our other documentation as well. And so that will be, we're aiming for early 2021. Given the limitations that are happening over at WRI, they're currently not taking applications. So this is a good opportunity for us to collect feedback from you so that when we are able to move forward with WRI, we'll have done our due diligence internally. And then ultimately the plan is to move forward with IAEG seeking full board approval at the April 2021, hopefully in person, face-to-face, but we shall see how 2021 plays out. And as I mentioned, we'll continue that annual maintenance process. So we aim to keep in sync with the reporting cycle. So that's something that we'll also be reaching out to you to understand when are your reporting expectations due, what are some of the timing and milestones that we'll need to have in place given the external reporting expectations. And so, right now we have the documentation online. You see the link there in the slides that will go out. The clean copy of the Excel tool as well as the user guide and methodology are available to you. And I apologize, we did not update the placeholder contact info, but you can contact through Krister or myself in order to ask any clarifying questions, but we would like to capture all of your feedback in a SurveyMonkey, which will be forthcoming. And so we'll be working on designing some questions that hopefully will be helpful to garner the sort of feedback we need to ultimately get to the point where we're submitting this for those various approvals in the future.
Okay, well that's sort of it on the demonstration side. We do have some time remaining to maybe answer a few questions if we received any. Madison, did you? I don't have access to what might have been sent in.
No questions have actually been sent in so far, but you are right. Okay. There are a few minutes, so if people do want to type things in. Thank you both very much for that presentation, and a reminder, as Erin said, we will be sending all of this out in the recording, so you will be able to access this on your own time as well to review. Perfect. All right, so I think that's everything. Unless, did you guys have anything else to say before closing off?
No, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I realize these web-based things are probably getting a little old. screen time we all have, but hopefully you found it useful and we enjoyed showing you this, and really want to encourage you to please take a look at it and get back to us with your comments. So with that, thanks a lot, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you. Have a great day.